Chapter 4. The desert air was hot and dry. As the sand dunes gave way to the greener banks of the Nile, the air was a little more humid, but the breeze soon drove away what moisture there was. The reeds waved in the wind and shimmered in the heat haze as the river ran quietly on. A single tree stood on one bank, towering over the reeds, split and blackened and dying. It was still, even as the reeds around it waved and swayed quietly. Then the calm of the river bank was broken. A noise like thunder rose from the river, swelling and vibrating. The sound ground its way heavily into a grating rhythm, louder than the cry of a hippopotamus. It grew louder with each discordant strain until it crescendoed with a thump of achievement. The tree quivered and shook as a heavy object washed up against it, jamming hard in the mud. In a moment, it was quiet again. Just the river, the breeze, the reeds and the tree, and the solid blue box of the TARDIS stuck fast in the muddy bank of the ancient River Nile. Atkins was beginning to lose his cool. And not before time, thought Tegan. He seemed to have taken being accosted by cloaked and hooded figures and bundled into a large sarcophagus almost in his stride. But Tegan had been pleased to see that he took slightly longer to adjust to the fact that the sarcophagus was in fact a dimensionally transcendental TARDIS in which the Doctor and Tegan were quite relieved to find themselves. Even so, he seemed remarkably unperturbed considering. "An interesting phenomenon, Doctor," he had commented. "I'm sure his lordship would be most intrigued to examine it. He has an interest in such things, as I am sure you are aware." After that, he seemed perfectly happy to stand straight and still with his hands firmly clasped behind his back. He watched the image on the scanner together with Tegan and the Doctor, but apart from verifying that the pictures being relayed showed that the TARDIS was being carried from the British Museum over a bridge and then dropped into the Thames, he displayed very little interest in the technology behind the display of the images, or the stability of the floor, considering the movement of the exterior. "It's merely a window, is it not?" he replied, when Tegan asked him why he was not surprised. She saw the Doctor stifle a grin. She hung her cloak on the hat stand and thought about this. Perhaps Atkins was right. From her 20th century perspective, everything had to be a technological marvel. From Atkins's point of view, it was a new version of an established and unremarkable concept. The difference was in what he assumed and in his attitude of disinterest. "Actually, it's very sad," the Doctor murmured to Tegan as she stomped off to join him at the console. "What is?" The Doctor nodded towards where Atkins stood, watching them with apparent disinterest. "No sense of wonder," the Doctor said quietly. "He's lost the fascination and awe, thrown out the child when he became an adult. Sad." Tegan looked at Atkins again. He did not look particularly sad, or as if he had any notion that he was missing out on anything, particularly wonder. "Boring, more like," Tegan said as they landed. Without bothering to check the scanner, the Doctor pushed the red lever which opened the door and ushered Tegan and Atkins out into the heat. And that was when Atkins began to lose his cool. Tegan, too, had felt the heat immediately. Leaving the TARDIS was like walking into a spongy wall. But while the sudden change had seemed to disorientate Atkins, and leave him even more perplexed than the interior of the TARDIS, to Tegan it was like coming home to Brisbane in high summer. The Doctor stood, hands in pockets, hat on head, and surveyed the scenery. Atkins stood, mouth open, without saying anything. Tegan called out that she was off to change into something cooler as she hurried back into the TARDIS, her long skirts sweeping a trail of damp mud after her. By the time she re-emerged, back in her rather lighter and cooler chemise and culottes, Atkins and the doctor were engaged in conversation. Atkins was pointing into the hazy distance, while the doctor stared at his feet, which were shuffling in the sand. Tegan climbed up the muddy riverbank to join them. "Doctor," Atkins was saying, "I am quite prepared to accept your word for it that this is indeed Egypt." "Thank you. I have been to the country with his lordship on several expeditions and recognise the general climate and landscape." Atkins gestured round, nodding to Tegan as he noticed she had rejoined them. His nod stopped short as he noticed her attire. But he recovered himself almost immediately and returned to his point. "However, I cannot accept that those are the Great Pyramids." "Why not?" Tegan asked as she shielded her eyes from the bright sun and stared in the direction Atkins had indicated. "At least they don't look too far away." Atkins and the doctor both stared at her. Tegan felt she ought to say something. "They are quite big, though." "Bigger than you think," the doctor said. "Several days' walk at least." "You're kidding." The doctor shook his head. "Remember the first time you saw a wide-bodied airliner?" She nodded. Atkins looked blankly from the doctor to Tegan. "Was it as big as you had imagined?" the doctor asked. Tegan laughed. "Much bigger. Huge. I thought it might be as big as a small house, but it was bigger than a street." "Well," the doctor pointed to the largest of the pyramids on the horizon, "inside that one, you could fit nearly 900 of those and leave room to walk round and look at them." Tegan thought about this. "Big, then." "Huge," the doctor agreed. Atkins coughed politely and broke the ensuing silence. "I would contend, however, that the suggestion that those are the Great Pyramids of Giza is not sustained. While their configuration and size is, I shall admit, the same, Miss Jovanka." "Tegan," she cut in. "Miss Tegan," Atkins corrected himself without hesitation, "you will see at once that their constitution is entirely different. You will observe, for example, that they are rather lighter in colour, almost shining as they reflect the sunlight. The tops, too, are of quite a different appearance." As Tegan's view cleared and her eyes adjusted to the heat haze, she could see what Atkins meant. The pyramids were on the horizon, the sun seemingly right above them, and they gleamed in the reflected light. Tegan had never been to Egypt before, though she had seen numerous photographs and films of the pyramids. The structures she knew were of a sand-coloured stone, ragged at the edges and blunted slightly at the tops. These buildings were subtly different. They were gleaming white, clean as porcelain, and their perfectly outlined shapes were topped with gold. The pyramids Tegan knew were magnificent. These were magnificent too, but they were also splendid. Beside her, the doctor sighed. "Those are, I'm afraid, the pyramids you know, Mr. Atkins." He gazed at them for a moment, shaking his head in obvious admiration. "Inexplicable splendour of Ionian white and gold," he muttered. Then he turned back to Atkins. "There is just one small thing I should explain, though." "Don't tell us, Doctor," Tegan said. "This is ancient Egypt, right?" The doctor nodded. "Terrific." "Ancient Egypt?" Atkins asked. "I am not familiar with the place, I'm afraid." "It's not a place," Tegan told him. "It's a time." Atkins gaped again. He was getting rather good at it, Tegan thought. "No," he said at last. "You cannot seriously expect me to believe that I have been transported back Thousands of years in time? That is simply incredible. Oh, really? The doctor smiled. More incredible than being transported thousands of miles. You seem to accept that with equanimity. Atkins considered. And, while he did, Tegan edged closer to the doctor. I thought you said we couldn't prevent what happened to Nyssa, she said quietly. So why are we here? I don't think we can, the doctor replied. Time is already set in its course, crystallized upon a particular webway. But we have to try. That's not what you said when we wanted to go back and save Adric. There was a note of accusation in her voice. Atkins had been about to say something, but he seemed to sense attention and kept his peace. The doctor did not answer at once. He looked down at the TARDIS and then back towards the distant pyramids. Finally, he turned to face Tegan and looked her directly in the eye. When Adric died, I knew we couldn't save him. Just as I know we can't stop what happened to Nyssa. Everything I have learned about how time works, about our relationship with it, tells me that's the case. He turned away, looking back at the TARDIS, lying wedged against a dead tree while the River Nile washed around its base. So, the doctor turned back to Tegan. He smiled a sad half-smile and placed a hand on her shoulder. What if I'm wrong? They stood in silence for a while. Then the doctor set off across the sand towards the pyramids. Come along, we've a long walk ahead of us. Atkins shrugged and followed. Tegan waited a moment before she too started walking. It is time. Amosis stood in the doorway. Citamon looked up as he spoke. She had been washing Nyssa's feet. Now she dried them quickly with a rough cloth and cleared away the bowl and water. Already? Nyssa asked. The last day had been a waking nightmare. She had tried to leave the temple, but each time been escorted back by priests with short swords. She had assumed she had some time, perhaps years even, before whatever ritual fate awaited her was enacted. But she had no doubt from Amosis's tone and his words what he meant. The High Priest will escort you to the procession, Amosis said. Everything will be according to the spells for coming forth by day. Really? At least it sounds nice. Nyssa tried to sound defiant and sarcastic. She tried to sound like Tegan, but her words seemed to herself more like those of a child. Her last attempts at defiance ended when Amosis said, It is also known as the Book of the Dead. In the following silence, Citamon bowed to Nyssa. I shall watch the ceremony, though I may not attend it, and I shall pray to Anubis for your your soul, she said. Nyssa could see that the handmaiden's eyes were moist, but even so she was surprised when Citamon leaned forward suddenly and kissed her on the cheek. May your heart weigh heavy, Nyssa, she said. Then she turned and ran from the room. Nyssa stared after her. Citamon had never called her by her real name before. As she watched the doorway, a figure appeared from outside, paused silhouetted on the threshold, then stepped into the room. He was short, like all the Egyptians Nyssa had met, but quite broadly built. His head was shaved, and he wore a ceremonial chain of office round his neck, hanging over his bare chest. You! Nyssa gasped. The newcomer looked surprised. My goddess, we have not met before. I am the High Priest of Nephthys. Rasul, Nyssa said quietly. I know. We may not have met before, Nyssa told him, but we shall. We shall. I doubt it, Rasul said. "Today is a day for celebration. Today is the day of your funeral." Nissa thought for a word or phrase he might remember in the years ahead. She struggled to remember some detail that might hit home or make an impression, that might hurt. "I have heard it said that a father should not outlive his children," she said quietly. It certainly had an effect. Rasul swayed on his heels, the shock flaring in his eyes. "I would not pray for your father," he said at last, "but for his daughter." The face was enormous, jutting up from the sand as if dropped from above into the desert. They could see it from miles away, slowly looming larger as they approached. "That I do recognize," Atkins said as they got close enough to begin to make out the details of the features, the line of the cheek, and the fractured nose. "The Great Sphinx," the doctor agreed. "But it's buried." Tegan could recognize the face too now, but without the huge lion's body to support it, the nature of the statue was completely changed. They walked round it once. "People have been digging it out ever since it was built," the doctor said. "Whenever that was." "You mean you don't know?" Tegan teased. "Well, not exactly. Always meant to pop back and see. But the trouble with being a Time Lord is that you never seem to have the time." He grinned and motioned for them to continue towards the still distant pyramids. As Tegan approached, he put an arm round her shoulder. "The Egyptians call the Great Sphinx Abu el-Hob," he told her. "The father of terror," Atkins said quietly as he joined them. "Yes," the doctor seemed surprised. "A rather literal translation, but accurate nonetheless." The wrappings were tight and smelled of resin. Nissa struggled, trying to tear her limbs from the priests who held them pressed against her body. But as the embalmers continued their work, seemingly oblivious to Nissa's shouts and struggles, she felt her power of movement more and more restricted. Citamun had not returned, and Nissa felt alone, helpless and terrified. Rasul stood watching as the embalmers completed their work. Only Nissa's head was now free of the linen wrappings. Amosis was behind her, and she twisted to see what he was doing. He seemed to be mixing powders in a small bowl. As she strained to watch, he dripped some liquid from a small earthenware bottle onto the powder. Immediately, it started to bubble and smoke. Amosis held the bowl away from him, taking care not to inhale the fumes, and turned to Rasul. Rasul took the smoking bowl. He too avoided breathing in the smoke, which was now drifting across the room. Nissa could smell the pungent aroma. It was like the ceremonial incense burned on Trakan at religious ceremonies. As Rasul brought the bowl closer, she tried to pull away, but her entire body was held firm within the wrappings. "The start of eternity," Rasul said quietly, as he held the bowl one-handed under Nissa's chin. "Drink deep of the fumes of oblivion, and know what it is to join Osiris in his netherworld of darkness." Nissa tried to keep her head upright, to pull her face away from the smoke rising from the bowl. But with his free hand, Rasul grabbed her hair and forced her to look down into the fumes. "No, the doctor will stop you." Nissa hoped she sounded confident, but she doubted the doctor would find her now. "He always stops people like you." She struggled for a moment, shaking her head and trying to pull away. But already she could feel consciousness slipping from her. "No, please." Nissa's eyes closed, the smoke stinging under her eyelids. "Tell me about the doctor," Rasul's voice floated through the mist, quiet and reasonable. The smoke was her world, and she felt herself drifting into a deep sleep. The sounds and smells of the room around her, including her own voice as she obeyed Rasul's command, floated into the distance. Her last thought as she lost consciousness, her last thought for millennia, was that wherever she was going, she might find her father. From his expeditions with Lord Kenilworth, and from general interest, Atkins knew a little of the history and geography of Egypt. When Kenilworth had first started his excursions, obsessed with the notion of making new and exciting discoveries, Atkins had been the only other member of the party. While he was not one to show overt appreciation or emotion, some of his employer's enthusiasm and passion had rubbed off. Atkins had passed many of the lonely evenings in Cairo hotels, while Kenilworth tried vainly to drum up financial support, reading through some of his employer's textbooks and reference works on the subject. If Kenilworth had noticed his manservant's increased interest and erudition, he had been polite enough not to mention it. But he had taken more and more time and trouble to include Atkins in the running of the expeditions. Lady Kenilworth seemed content to leave them to their play, her interest in travel and things Egyptians being limited to her desire to be near her husband. When he had, sadly, been forced to suggest that Atkins look after Lady Kenilworth and the London house while he was away on his latest expedition, Atkins had been secretly devastated. But Lady Kenilworth was recovering from a fever and unable to travel, so she needed the support of her butler as well as her housekeeper. Atkins was sure it was for reassurance and because of her ladyship's illness, rather than any slight on the abilities of the supremely capable Miss Warne. Atkins was pleased he had been able to offer some small assistance to the doctor by translating Abu el-Hob. He had felt the same suppressed tremor of delight at the doctor's appreciation and surprise as when he had first been able to offer informed advice to Kenilworth. So it was in a lighter mood, all problematic thoughts of travelling through the ages and across the continent put aside, that he followed the doctor and the strange Miss Tegan. He walked proud, bold, and upright, and wondered if perhaps he could remove his jacket. After some deliberation, he decided that it would probably be permissible, provided, of course, he did not loosen his necktie or collar. He carried his jacket over his arm, and wondered whether the doctor, in his white sweater and long frock coat, was not beginning to feel the heat. "Do you know where we're going?" Miss Tegan asked the doctor. The doctor nodded. "Of course. I took the precaution of ascertaining from Lord Kenilworth where the tomb was." "And where is it?" The doctor stopped, and Atkins caught them up as he pointed to a small pyramid. It stood alone, smaller and closer than the main pyramids, nestled in a hollow as if it had been dug out of the desert. Unlike the other pyramids, which gleamed and shone in the bright sunlight, this pyramid was jet black. It seemed almost to absorb the light rather than to reflect it. As Atkins looked, he fancied he could just make out small figures gathered at the base of the pyramid. Some sort of welcoming party for an ant-tiny procession which was making its way slowly across the desert sands towards the structure. "I rather fancy that it's over there," the doctor said. There were 18 oxen, each steaming hot breath through its flared nostrils and kicking up dust from the sandy floor. The sledge they dragged through the dunes bore a single inlaid casket. Behind the dust cloud followed the priests and then the mourners. The shrieking and ululation wailed itself to a halt as the oxen drew up outside the black pyramid. They stamped and blew as the priests surrounded the sledge. The priests lifted the heavy casket and carried it ceremonially to the high doorway into the pyramid. The step up from the sand to the floor level formed a natural dais. The coffin was first lowered to the floor, then raised upright on the threshold so that the stylized female figure looked out over the assembled crowd. As at most funerals, almost all of the mourners were hired professionals. They tore their hair, smote their chests, and shrieked as if the coffin contained Osiris himself. There was only one person present who could be termed a friend. Standing alone, crying quietly at the back of the mourners, was the handmaiden Citamon. Alone until she was joined by the doctor, Tegan, and Atkins. She watched them walk out of the desert and stand at the back of the crowd. Their clothes and their conversation were strange, just as the goddesses had been strange when she first joined Citamon and Amosis in the anteroom of the temple. Citamon edged closer and listened, though she understood little of what the newcomers were saying. "I'm afraid it looks as though we may be too late," Atkins pointed to the sarcophagus standing upright in the pyramid entrance. "That is the casket in which your friend was incarcerated, is it not?" The doctor nodded grimly. "Looks like Blinovitch was right after all," he said quietly. "Still, it was worth a shot." "A few hours, that's all." Tegan wiped a tear from her cheek. "A few sodding hours earlier and we could have stopped them." "No, Tegan, no." The doctor patted her shoulder. "It had already happened when we decided to come here. The web of time has crystallized at this node. It might as well be set in stone." "So what do we do?" "Well, we'll just have to try something else. We still have a couple of options, and we're no worse off now than we were before we came." Tegan was not convinced. "It's just, being so close and yet—" She searched for a way to express her frustration, anger, and grief. She gave up. "Oh, rabbits," she said. "I'm afraid I follow very little of this," Atkins confessed, as they watched the priest fuss round the coffin 50 yards away. "But I'm not sure how rabbits will help, unless you are planning some new feat of temporal prestidigitation." "I'm afraid not," the doctor confessed. "Why don't we just go back to yesterday and try again to save your friend?" "Bloomin' Blinovitch," Tegan told him. The doctor tried to explain more. "The link between the time zones, between us and the here and now, if you like, has already been established. Probably by the very fact that Nissa was brought here. So from now on, time moves at the same relative rate. We spend a day hunting for Nissa, and a day passes in this time. It's as if the two times, yours and Nissa's, are joined together by a steel rod, so you can't move one without adjusting the other by the exact same amount." "And why is that?" This threw the doctor for a second. "Why, well, according to Blinovitch, it's something to do with temporal dynamics and their relationship to the real-world envelope. But I think it's really because otherwise things would just be too easy." Atkins considered. "So we really are too late?" The doctor did not answer immediately. He stuck his hands in his pockets and looked down at the sand at his feet. Then he raised his head and looked Atkins in the eye. "That depends on what for." They held each other's gaze for a long moment. Then the doctor flashed a sudden smile, turning abruptly to the young woman who had moved so she was standing next to Atkins. "How do you do?" he said, his teeth gleaming white in the sun. "I'm the doctor. How can we help?" The woman hesitated, looking from the doctor to each of his companions in turn. Eventually she asked, "You are friends of the goddess?" They looked at her blankly. "Of Nissa?" The most senior priests removed the lid of the casket, leaving the base and the mummy inside standing in the pyramid's doorway. The mummy itself was not completely wrapped. The head was still free of bandages, lolled to one side as if in sleep, dark hair falling in loose curls about the linen shoulders. At the back of the crowd of mourners, Tegan turned away, her hands to her mouth. "Oh, God!" she gasped. "Doctor, I can see her face!" High Priest Rasul, in full regalia, approached the mummy. He held up the ceremonial adze, the loosed sleeves of his gold cloak falling like wings to his sides as he held it aloft. Then he turned in a swirl of golden motion and pressed the adze to the mouth of the mummy, parting the girl's lips so that the adze grazed her clenched teeth as she seemed to kiss the blade. As he held the adze in position, Rasul chanted the ancient words of power, the standard litany to restore sight, speech, and hearing to the dead. Except that the woman was not dead, and would not have her senses restored. Her ba, her soul, would remain forever locked with the ka, the vital force of the body, within the mummified body, and together with them... Next, Rasul weighed the heart. He chanted the words of the incarnation for the mummified woman. "O heart of my being, do not witness against me. Do not betray me before my judges." It was not her real heart, for that still beat, although more and more slowly, within the woman's breast. Instead, a golden replica of a human heart was placed on one side of the scales. The Anubis priest dropped the feather that symbolized Mart on the other side. And as the scales fell in favour of the heart, the feather lifting away, the priest, dressed as Anubis, hissed his appreciation and carried the scales from the pyramid doorway. Then Rasul took the canopic jar. He carried it carefully, reverently, to the coffin. He held it high above his head so all could see, and then he turned and held it out to the mummified goddess. Rasul's body blocked the crowd's view, so they did not see him tear the stopper from the jar, did not see him thrust the open end towards the face of the goddess, did not see the goddess's hair blown back as if by a breeze. And they did not see Nissa's eyes snap open, or the hint of a smile that traced across her mouth before the eyes closed again for a millennia. The weighing of the heart, the doctor said, is the ancient Egyptian way of sorting out the wheat from the chaff, or the sheep from the goats. "It is to test innocence and purity," Sitterman said. She did not understand what the doctor had meant, and felt she should explain. "Huh?" Tegan almost laughed. "Nissa should have no trouble there." "But I don't recognise that last ceremony," the doctor went on, ignoring Tegan's comment. "Do you know what it was?" he asked the handmaiden. "It was the return of the spirit," she said simply. "Why?" Tegan said. "Where's it gone?" "I do not know." "Well, what does the ceremony usually mean? What does it enact?" Sitterman shook her head. "I have never seen it before," she confessed quietly. "You mean this is your first funeral?" Sitterman looked at Tegan, puzzled. Then her face fell, and she almost burst into tears. Tegan's words seemed to her, a temple handmaiden responsible for the souls of the dead and their departure, an accusation of negligence of her most holy duties. It was Atkins who held her hands and spoke kindly to her. "I am in service too," he said. "We are not asking you to betray a trust or to dishonour your employers in any way. But the doctor and Miss Tegan are desperate to help their friend, our friend, and to do that we need your help." "It is not that," Sitterman told him, when she had recovered her composure a little. "I wish you well. Nissa was a friend of mine also." She turned to address Tegan directly. "I have attended many funerals, as is my station, but the ceremony of the return of the spirit is never performed." She looked round at her new friends. It is a ceremony written solely for this occasion, she said. The others exchanged glances. And what is it? What is the ceremony about? You must know something. I only know that it concerns the jar, Doctor. Jar? What jar? The doctor grabbed Sitterman, her dark skin whitening under the grip of his fingers. Doctor? Atkins murmured, and gently removed the doctor's hands from Sitterman's bare shoulders. Any small detail may help us, he told her. Sitterman decided to start from the beginning and tell them everything, even what she was sure they must already know. Your friend Nissa, she said, was sent to us by the gods. She appeared to us in the temple at the appointed place and hour as the perfect sacrifice to appease Horus. Appease him for what? Many years ago, many hundreds of years ago, grave robbers entered the sacred tomb of the goddess Nephthys. Who's Nephthys? Tegan asked. Sister of Osiris, Atkins told her. And more importantly, the doctor said, the wife and sister of Seth. So why the big fuss? What did they steal? Nothing, Sitterman said. They all died in the tomb. It was the will of the gods. But, prompted the doctor. But a canopic jar was cracked. So what was in this jar? Tegan asked. Raspberry jam? I do not know. And why the importance for this ceremony? I do not know. I say only what I have heard. But the jar was cracked many centuries ago, and recently it has started to crumble. The priests were worried, whispering in the temple corridors and meeting after dark. Sitterman considered, remembering some of the looks she had seen on the faces of the priests as they had left the meetings. The priests were scared, she said. And then Nissa turned up, and everything was suddenly all right again. Sitterman nodded. Yes, Doctor, and now she will be entombed in the Black Pyramid, with the mummy of the goddess Nephthys and the sacred relics of power. Behind them, the priests replaced the lid heavily on the casket and lifted it onto their shoulders. Entombed for all eternity. They carried it slowly into the Black Pyramid. As they crossed the threshold, the Stygian darkness swallowed them up. They watched as the priests re-emerged and the stone door was slotted into the opening. Then the priests bowed and the rested oxen were led away. The mourners lined up to be paid and started to drift back towards the huge pyramids on the distant horizon. The doctor shook Sitterman's bemused hand. You've been very helpful, he said. Thank you. And thank you for being kind to Nissa too. I think she must have needed a friend. He turned to Tegan and Atkins. Come along, you two. We've got things to do. Like what? Like get back to 1896 and make sure Lord Kenilworth finds the mummy and gets it safely back to London. Otherwise, no matter what Blinovitch might think, we'll never have found out what happened to Nissa, and she really will rest in there for all eternity. Sitterman stood alone for an hour. She looked at the pyramid where her friend was buried, while the three strangers walked back into the sandy wastes of the empty wilderness. London, 1975. The gleaming whiteness of the scientist's newly laundered lab coat contrasted with the stained bandages wrapping the mummy. The scientist smiled. White teeth, white coat, in a white room standing by a white-faced bank of equipment. His assistant stood ready beside the stainless steel trolley, ready to wheel the mummy into the scanner. His lab coat contrasted with his dark skin. How does it work? The scientist turned to the control panel, tapped a dial, and adjusted a knob. It X-rays the subject from all angles to create a three-dimensional composite image of the body. It'll show the outline of the body within the bandages and any jewellery folded inside. He inspected a few more readings, then nodded to the assistant. Right, let's get started. The assistant gently rolled the trolley along its track into the circular opening of the huge metal tunnel of the scanner. How appropriate that it should be a cat that releases the secrets of the goddess, he said quietly, shutting the heavy lead door behind the trolley. Releases? The scientist was beside him, checking the seals on the door. And what cat is that? He asked, not really interested, most of his mind on the task ahead. The assistant gestured at the machine. C-A-T, he spelled out. Ah, computerized axial tomography. The scientist made a final minute adjustment and threw the main switch. Well, let's see what secrets our friend is keeping, shall we? The monitor screen glowed into life, throwing negative images onto the glass as the scanner recorded the details of the mummy from every angle. Somewhere outside, an owl hooted in the night, and a train whistled in the darkness. The images blurred across the scientist's retina. The points of light against the dark looked more like the night sky than the innards of the mummy. He was vaguely aware of his new assistant standing beside him. The assistant was muttering something that the scientist could not catch or understand. Words in his native Egyptian tongue, phrases that sounded full of strength and power. The volume built with the steadily increasing hum of the CAT scanner. The scientist continued to watch the pictures of black and white intensity blasted across his retina. He watched the woman taken to the tomb. He watched the mummy placed in the casket. He watched the tomb sealed. He felt the energy and understanding building inside his mind. And beside him, Sadan Rasul continued to intone the words from the scroll of Thoth and called on the power of his goddess.